The Hesperus cut through the North Atlantic swells like a blade through black silk, her bow cleaving waves that had traveled thousands of miles to crash against the remote Flannan Isles. Captain James Harvey gripped the wheel with white knuckles, his weathered face etched with concern as he stared through the December gloom toward Alien Moor, the largest of the three barren islands that rose from the sea like the backs of sleeping leviathans. "There's no light, Captain," called First Mate Morrison from the bow, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "The lighthouse should be visible by now." Harvey's stomach clenched. For 23 days, ships had reported the absence of the Flannan Isles light, a beacon that had faithfully guided vessels through these treacherous waters since 1899. The Northern Lighthouse Board had dispatched the Hesperus to investigate why the three keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur, had gone silent. As they drew closer to the island's rocky shore, an unnatural stillness seemed to descend upon the waters. The wind, which had been howling moments before, dropped to an eerie whisper. Even the seabirds that typically swarmed these islands were nowhere to be seen. "Drop anchor in the bay," Harvey ordered, his voice hoarse. "We'll take the dinghy to shore." The lighthouse stood like a white sentinel against the gray sky, its lamp room dark and lifeless. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The building appeared intact, showing no signs of storm damage that might explain the keeper's absence. Yet the very air around the island seemed to vibrate with malevolence, as if the rocks themselves were watching. Morrison and two other crew members rowed Harvey to the small landing stage. The usual mooring ropes hung loose, dancing in the wind like hanged men's nooses. No one came to greet them. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against stone. "Ahoy there!" Harvey called out, his voice echoing off the cliff faces. "Marshall? Duckett? MacArthur?" Nothing. Not even an echo returned his calls. The path up to the lighthouse wound between jagged rocks and patches of coarse grass that whispered secrets in a language older than man. With each step, Harvey felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him. The crew followed in tense silence, their boots crunching on gravel that seemed to shift and move beneath their feet. The lighthouse compound consisted of the main tower, the keeper's quarters, and various outbuildings. All appeared normal from the outside, yet something indefinably wrong hung in the air like the stench of decay. The windows of the quarters stared out at them like dead eyes, their glass reflecting nothing but emptiness. Harvey approached the entrance to the keeper's quarters and knocked firmly on the wooden door. The sound echoed hollowly, as if the building were completely empty. When no response came, he tried the handle. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that made every man's skin crawl. "Hello?" he called into the darkness beyond. "Anyone there?" The interior of the quarters was neat and tidy, as if the keepers had simply vanished mid-task. The kitchen table was set for a meal, but the food had long since spoiled, filling the air with a sickly sweet odor that made the men gag. A chair was overturned, as if someone had risen from it in great haste. Morrison lit an oil lamp, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Look at this," he whispered, pointing to the table. 3 plates sat ready, but only 2 had been touched. The third remained pristine, as if waiting for someone who never came. In the main room, the logbook lay open on a writing desk. Harvey approached it with trembling hands, dreading what he might find. The entries were written in Thomas Marshall's careful script, documenting the routine duties and weather observations. But as Harvey read the final entries, his blood turned to ice. December 12, severe winds. MacArthur says he hears voices in the wind. Told him it's just the storm, but I heard them too. They're calling our names. December 13, storm worse than anything I've experienced. Duckett refuses to go outside. Says there's something moving in the rocks. The sea is angry, but it's more than that. Something is coming. December 14, the voices are constant now. They speak in a language that hurts to hear. MacArthur hasn't eaten in 2 days. Duckett bars the door at night. I can feel them pressing against the windows. December 15, God help us. They're not voices in the wind. They're inside the lighthouse. The entry ended there, the pen having been dropped mid-sentence, leaving a long ink stain across the page like dried blood. Harvey's hands shook as he closed the logbook. The date of the last entry was December 15, 1900, exactly 31 days ago. But what had happened in those final moments? Where were the 3 keepers? "Captain," Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. "We should check the lighthouse tower." The men exchanged glances, none wanting to venture into the tall structure that loomed above them like a pale finger pointing accusingly at the sky. Yet duty demanded they investigate further. Armed with lanterns, they approached the tower's entrance. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of absolute darkness beyond. Harvey pushed it open, and immediately a blast of frigid air struck them, carrying with it a sound that made every man's blood freeze, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the tower. The spiral staircase wound upward into blackness, each step creaking ominously under their weight. The humming grew louder as they climbed, joined by what sounded like whispered conversations in a tongue that predated human civilization. The lantern flames flickered wildly, casting impossible shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Halfway up the tower, Morrison stopped suddenly. "Captain," he gasped, pointing at the stone wall. "Look at this." Scratched into the ancient stone were symbols that hurt to look at directly, twisted patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the lantern light. They covered the entire wall, growing denser and more frantic toward the top of the tower. Some appeared to have been carved with fingernails, leaving dark stains that might have been blood. "What kind of men would do such a thing?" one of the crew whispered. But Harvey knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that these marks had not been made by human hands. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life, and staring at them too long brought whispers of madness to the edges of his mind. They continued their ascent, each step becoming more difficult as an oppressive weight seemed to press down upon them. The air grew thicker, almost viscous, as if they were climbing through invisible molasses. The humming had evolved into something resembling a chant, punctuated by sounds that might have been screams or laughter. It was impossible to tell which. At the top of the tower, the lamp room awaited them behind a door that stood wide open. The massive lens apparatus sat dark and cold, its intricate prisms coated with a thin film of what looked like frost, except frost couldn't form in patterns that resembled anguished faces. But it was not the condition of the lighthouse lamp that made the men cry out in horror. It was what surrounded it. The three lighthouse keepers sat in chairs arranged in a perfect triangle around the lens. Their bodies were perfectly preserved, showing no signs of decay despite having been dead for over a month. Their eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the great lens, and their mouths were stretched wide in eternal screams that no sound could escape. Each man's hands were positioned on the arms of his chair, fingers extended as if reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Their lighthouse uniforms were unmarked by violence, yet the expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces spoke of horrors beyond human comprehension. "Sweet Jesus," Morrison breathed, crossing himself repeatedly. "What happened to them?" Harvey approached Thomas Marshall's body with trembling legs. The head keeper's logbook lay open in his lap, and with shaking hands, Harvey lifted it to read the final entries that had not been there when they'd examined the book downstairs. The handwriting became increasingly erratic with each line. "They came from the sea but not through the water. They rise through the stones, through the very foundation of the earth. The lighthouse calls to them, it always has. We were never keepers of the light. We were feeders of the dark. MacArthur sees them clearly now. They stand in the corners where shadows gather, tall as men but wrong in every proportion. Their faces are holes in reality, and when they speak, stars die." Duckett tried to run. Found him on the rocks below, but he was still breathing. Still screaming. They brought him back. They always bring them back. The lens is not what we thought. It doesn't cast light, it gathers darkness from across the universe. Every night we lit it, we made the beacon stronger. God forgive us, we've been feeding them for months. They want us to join them. To become part of the lens, part of the light that calls to others. I can feel my body changing, becoming one with the apparatus. Soon we'll be part of the beacon forever, calling to ships, calling to. The writing ended in an illegible scrawl that looked more like the tracks of insects than human letters. As Harvey read the impossible words, the lamp room began to change around them. The temperature plummeted until their breath came in visible puffs, and the frost patterns on the lens began to shift and swirl like living things. The humming that had followed them up the tower crescendoed into a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly through their bones. One of the crew members, a young sailor named Peters, suddenly pointed at the lens with a trembling finger. "Captain, he whispered, his voice cracking with terror. Look at the glass. Within the prisms of the great lens, shapes were moving. At first they appeared to be reflections of the men themselves, but as the crew watched in growing horror, the figures in the glass began to change. They grew taller, their features stretching and distorting until they resembled something that might once have been human but had been twisted by forces beyond comprehension. The figures in the lens beckoned to them with impossibly long fingers, their mouths moving in silent invitation. As they gestured, the three dead keepers slowly began to turn their heads, their necks creaking like rusty hinges, until their terror-frozen eyes fixed upon the living men. "Run," Harvey whispered, then shouted as understanding flooded through him. "Run." But as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked. Standing in the doorway was a figure that had once been Donald MacArthur, the youngest of the three keepers. His body was translucent, shot through with veins of pale light that pulsed in rhythm with the lens behind them. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot leave," he said, his words carrying the sound of waves crashing on distant shores. "The beacon must be maintained. The call must go out. Ships must come." Behind MacArthur, more figures materialized, generations of lighthouse keepers stretching back to the tower's construction, all bearing the same translucent quality, all pulsing with the same alien light. Their eyes held the accumulated weight of centuries of horror, and when they spoke in unison, reality seemed to shiver. "Join us," they chorused, their voices like the grinding of continental plates. "Become the beacon. Call to the ships. Feed the dark between the stars." Harvey felt his sanity fraying at the edges as the impossible truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. The lighthouse had never been what it seemed. Built on a site sacred to things older than human memory, it served not as a beacon to guide ships to safety, but as a lure, a cosmic fishing line cast into the void to attract prey for entities that dwelt in the spaces between realities. Every ship that had used the Flannan light to navigate had unknowingly offered a portion of its crew's life force to the hungry darkness that dwelt within the lens apparatus. The keepers, thinking they were performing a noble service, had been feeding an ancient evil that grew stronger with each passing night. Now that evil was ready to expand its reach, to transform the lighthouse into something even more terrible. The three keepers had been chosen not for their dedication to duty, but for their spiritual resonance with the alien forces that inhabited the tower. Their terror and despair had been the final ingredients needed to complete a transformation that had been centuries in the making. The lens began to emit its own light, not the clean yellow beam that had guided ships for decades, but a sickly phosphorescent glow that hurt to look at directly. Within that glow, impossible geometries twisted and folded, creating spaces that existed in dimensions the human mind couldn't grasp. "You feel it, don't you?" Thomas Marshall's voice drifted from his motionless lips, though his jaw never moved. "The pull of the infinite dark. The hunger that dwells in the cold between worlds. It's been calling to you since you first saw our island." And Harvey realized with mounting horror that it was true. Even now, as terror clawed at his mind, part of him wanted to step closer to the lens, to understand the secrets it contained. The alien light was beautiful in its wrongness, promising knowledge that would make him more than human, or perhaps less. Morrison grabbed his arm. "Captain, we have to go. Now." But when they turned toward the stairs, they found that the spiral staircase no longer led down to the familiar rooms below. Instead, it descended into a shaft of absolute darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than the tower's foundation, perhaps all the way to the molten core of the earth, or beyond. The crew huddled together in the lamp room as reality continued to warp around them. The walls of the lighthouse tower had become transparent, revealing not the familiar Scottish landscape beyond, but vistas of alien worlds under foreign stars. Seas of liquid mercury reflected the light of purple suns, while creatures that defied description moved through landscapes of crystalline bone and metallic flesh. "This is what they see," Duckett's voice whispered from the air itself. "Every keeper who tends the light eventually sees the truth. We are not alone in the universe, and we are not at the top of the cosmic hierarchy. We are food." The lens continued to pulse with its unholy radiance, and with each pulse, the barrier between dimensions grew thinner. Soon, the things that dwelt in those impossible realms would be able to cross over completely, bringing their hunger to a world unprepared for such cosmic horror. Peters, the youngest crew member, suddenly stepped forward toward the lens. His face had taken on a dreamy expression, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that no human throat should produce. I understand now, he said, his words creating visible ripples in the air. The light calls to us because we're already part of it. We've always been part of it. Every human who's ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was looking back, we're all connected to the darkness that feeds between worlds. Harvey watched in helpless horror as Peters reached out to touch the lens. The moment his fingertips made contact with the cursed glass, his body began to change. His flesh became translucent, revealing a network of pulsing energy that resembled both blood vessels and electrical circuits. His eyes began to glow with the same phosphorescent light that emanated from the lens. No, Harvey whispered, but even as he spoke, he felt the same pull affecting him. The light was inside his mind now, showing him visions of cosmic truth that were too vast and terrible for human comprehension. He saw the birth and death of galaxies, the rise and fall of civilizations beyond counting, and through it all, the patient hunger of entities that existed in the spaces between realities. Morrison tried to pull Peters away from the lens, but when he touched the transformed sailor, his own body began to undergo the same horrifying metamorphosis. The alien light was contagious, spreading from person to person like a plague of enlightenment. As more of the crew succumbed to the lens's influence, the lighthouse began to emit its signal once again. But this was not the familiar rotating beam that had guided ships safely through the waters around the Flannan Isles. This was something far more sinister, a beacon that called not just to vessels on the sea, but to minds across the world. In Edinburgh, lighthouse officials noted with relief that the Flannan Light had resumed operation. Ships' captains adjusted their courses, grateful for the beacon's return. None of them could have imagined that the light now served as a gateway for forces that viewed humanity as nothing more than a source of sustenance. The transformed crew members took their positions around the lens, joining the three original keepers in their eternal vigil. Their faces bore the same expression of transcendent terror, caught between human consciousness and alien awareness. They understood now that they were no longer individuals but components in a vast mechanism designed to harvest life force from across the galaxy. Harvey, still clinging to the last vestiges of his humanity, watched as his men became something other than human. Their bodies remained recognizable, but their souls, if such things existed, had been absorbed into the collective consciousness that operated the lighthouse. They were aware of their transformation but powerless to prevent it, conscious observers trapped within bodies that no longer belonged to them. The lens pulsed with increasing intensity, and with each pulse, Harvey felt more of his individual identity slipping away. The boundaries between self and other dissolved, replaced by a growing awareness of the cosmic machinery of which he was becoming a part. He could feel the hunger of the entities that dwelt in the dark between stars, could sense their satisfaction as the lighthouse beacon grew stronger. Through the transformed consciousness of his crew, Harvey became aware of other lighthouses around the world beginning to respond to the Flannan signal. The infection was spreading, turning humanity's own navigation systems against them. Soon, every beacon on every coast would serve the same alien purpose, calling ships not to safety but to transformation. 3 days after the Hesperus had failed to return, a rescue fleet was dispatched from the mainland. 5 ships approached the Flannan Isles, their crews scanning the waters for any sign of Harvey's vessel. They found the Hesperus anchored peacefully in the bay, but no one answered their hails. Captain William MacDonald of the rescue ship Challenger led a landing party to the lighthouse. As they climbed the familiar path, they noticed the peculiar quality of the light emanating from the tower, too bright, too white, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The lighthouse keeper's quarters appeared normal, though MacDonald noted with concern that the Hesperus crew's belongings were scattered throughout the rooms as if they had taken up residence. But it was when they climbed to the lamp room that they discovered the true horror of what had transpired. 23 figures sat in concentric circles around the lens apparatus, the 3 original keepers, Harvey and his 4-man crew, and others whose identities were lost to history. All bore the same expression of transcendent terror, their bodies serving as living conduits for energies that bridged the gap between dimensions. The lens itself had grown, expanding beyond its original housing to fill nearly the entire lamp room. Its surface writhed with patterns that hurt to look at directly, and within its crystalline depths, entire universes wheeled and spun in alien configurations. The light it emitted was no longer merely visible radiation but a form of energy that touched the very fabric of reality. MacDonald tried to retreat, but found his feet rooted to the floor as if the stone itself had grown up around his boots. One by one, his crew members began walking forward toward the lens, their faces taking on the same dreamy expression that had claimed Peters and the others. "Welcome," spoke a voice that came from all 23 figures simultaneously. "You have answered the call. Now you will help us spread it further." As the decades passed, the mystery of the Flannan Isles became legend. Ships continued to use the light for navigation, unaware that with each passage, they were feeding the growing hunger that dwelt within the lens. The lighthouse became a nexus for forces that operated on a cosmic scale, patient and methodical in their expansion across human civilization. Other lighthouses began to exhibit strange phenomena. Keepers reported voices in the wind, shadows that moved without casting objects, and an irresistible compulsion to stare into their lamp apparatus for hours at a time. One by one, coastal beacons around the world began to transform, their keepers disappearing or becoming something other than human. The entities that dwelt in the spaces between realities had found the perfect vector for their influence, humanity's own infrastructure of navigation and safety. They turned our lights against us, using our desire to guide travelers safely home as a mechanism to harvest the life force they needed to bridge the gap between dimensions. By the dawn of the 21st century, nearly every lighthouse on Earth served their alien purpose. Ships that relied too heavily on these beacons found their crews suffering from strange ailments, depression, dissociation, and an obsessive fascination with the sea that often led to mysterious disappearances during shore leave. The truth of the Flannan Isles remained buried in official reports and classified documents, dismissed as the ravings of traumatized sailors and the product of overactive imaginations. But late at night, when fog rolls in from the sea and distant lights pierce the darkness, those who know the truth can sometimes hear it, the cosmic hum of machinery that spans dimensions, feeding on human souls and calling others to join the eternal vigil. The lighthouse still stands on alien moor, its light visible for miles across the dark waters. Ships continued to use it for navigation, their crews grateful for its guidance through treacherous seas. None of them realize that the light which leads them home is the same light that will eventually call them back, to take their place among the watchers who tend the beacon between worlds. For the Flannan light never goes out. It cannot go out. Too many souls have been woven into its alien mechanism, too many minds absorbed into its cosmic awareness. It will burn until the stars themselves grow cold, calling to ships, calling to souls, calling to anyone foolish enough to believe that humanity stands alone in the vast darkness of space. And in the lamp room, surrounded by the crystalline growth that was once a simple navigation aid, the figures still sit in their eternal vigil. Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, Donald MacArthur, and all who came after them, their consciousness scattered across dimensions but their bodies forever bound to serve as conduits for forces beyond human understanding. They wait, patient as the stones beneath their feet, for the next ship to answer the call. For the next crew to climb the spiral stairs. For the next souls to join them in tending the light that bridges the gap between the world of the living and the hungry dark that dwells between the stars. The Flannan Isles lighthouse mystery was never solved because there was nothing to solve, only a truth too terrible for human minds to accept. In trying to bring light to the darkness, we had invited the darkness in. And it is still there, waiting in the light, calling to us all.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.